Even when I graduated, that craze was very common. The best minds, almost everyone that I knew who were really interested in the core fields, would all want to go to United States. That was the ultimate destination. Okay. Now fast forward to 2020s, a lot of it has changed. Okay, significantly. The middle class has risen significantly, and the culture itself has changed a lot. Now, in 1990s, most of the students who studied their undergraduate degree, most of them were not very rich. I mean, they didn't come from affluent backgrounds. Most of us came from lower to middle class families. Okay, that is no longer the case. Of course, India is still a very big country. There is huge economic inequality and all that, but that is no longer true. A lot of students who graduate from undergraduate institutes, good undergraduate institutes in the country, all of a lot significant chunk of them come from affluent families. In the sense, at least upper middle class, or middle class to upper middle class families. So therefore, students now are ready to think about entrepreneurship. They're ready to think about options that we would not think. The only thing that we used to think is either you get a job after undergrad, or you'd look for an MS, okay, immediately, and then look for job opportunities after that. Now I'll come back to this. This is very briefly about the history. If it was boring, I mean, you could have skipped this part. I'm sorry I didn't mention it before, but yeah, I'll come back to this now. So now, given all these facts, why, I mean, that's why you see TI has this 6 months training program in India, or at least 3 months of training program in India. Now they are also changing completely, because they see the changing landscape of higher education system in the country. Every company is adapting to that. Okay. So now the question is MS necessary for a career in semiconductors? Today, in 2020s, unless you are exceptionally good after your undergraduate degree, I would say still it's definitely recommended. Okay, unless you have let's say you have had your undergraduate degree from a very good institute, where the faculty in analog design are exceptionally good, where you got to work on some great stuff within you're lucky enough to do that within your undergraduate degree itself, then you don't really need a master's. Okay, you can straight away start working. But generally, I would highly recommend a master's degree for most of the students, if not for economic reasons. Otherwise, there are sometimes there is also the economic reason. Sometimes you really don't have money. You have to work hard so that you move upward socially. So education is the best way, is the most non-discriminative way through which you can move uh, socially upward. You climb the economic ladder. So then go for it. If money is a problem for you, then you don't really need a master's. You can really work hard as an undergrad, and then directly get into the work. And after some time, if you feel that you need a master's degree after a few years, then you can always go for a master's degree. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Now I'll just come to discussing the degrees, I mean the career choices with masters, BTech, and MS in US. Okay, so these are what are the options. How do you go about your career in analog and RF design, and it will also apply for digital design. Now, as I said, there are some companies which hire undergraduates directly after their BTech programs. TI is one company which I said it already is, because that's one of the oldest companies which had its research R&D centers in late 1980s itself in India. So therefore, they had to come up with a way of training because at that time we didn't have a great MS program in the country. A lot of students who graduated, very few of them were well trained in analog design, so they had to be trained for a few months before they could be given some work to do, in analog design itself, or before they could be trained like engineers. So TI hires engineers, and there are very few companies which hire engineers directly after their undergraduate programs. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare that. That is, you join your job immediately after your BTech program versus an option where you, after your BTech, instead of joining a job, you go for a master's or an MTech in India itself. and then join a job. The other option is immediately after your BTech, you go for an MS in US. Okay, and then we'll compare the three and see, then you can pick whatever suits you the best. Now, keep in mind, masters in US is an expensive deal. It's not very cheap. And one thing my students will often do is that compare Indian universities and American universities. They say that often, sometimes they say, no, the facilities are much better, even though in 2020s we have had significant growth in India. But in America, they do find the facilities to be much better. I say them that you are the reason for that. You should understand that some of the American universities significantly benefit from international students because the fees for international students is almost 2 to 3 times the native student. Okay, the citizens have to pay lower. International students have to pay much higher fees. Now understand, you're paying 2 to 3 times the fees, and you're also working much harder because immigrants have to prove themselves because it's a new world. They are setting their foot there, and so therefore they work much harder. So that's the best any system can get, right? You're paying much higher money and you're also working much harder, and it's benefiting that system. So we don't have American Indian higher education ecosystem doesn't have that. Okay, we don't have this supply of very high quality students who pay much higher fees and also work. Now, the reason in 1990s, of course, it's a exploitative system, but why would engineers go is that we didn't simply have equivalent high quality higher education in India back in 1990s. Okay, there were some good places, but the, if you compare the quantity, it was much smaller in India. So therefore, the only option to do was go for MS in US. Okay, which was understandable. Even though there was so much of money and effort spent, it was totally worth it. Okay, now today I'll compare these three options not in 1990s but in 2020s. Okay, now which is now in the current scenario. Now, in the current scenario, we do have some universities in India which offer almost MS education, especially in analog and digital design, as good as any top MS school in US. Okay, any top school in US, the master's education. I'm comparing the master's education. Okay, we do have similar quality educations, especially if I'm going to compare IIT Madras, it's as good as any of the best schools in US for analog and RF design. Okay, so we don't really see much big difference. The difference comes after you graduate from a master's program. Okay, so that's why what I'll do is, if you go for a master's degree, most of you would take some loans and go for educational loans and go for master's degree. So 2 years you do an MS, plus worst case, let's assume you don't get good fellowships, or you don't get good RA ships or TA ships. So worst case, you need to spend 2 more years to pay off those loans. So totally 4 years you are going to spend in United States. At the end of this 4 years, you're going to have a zero net savings. Okay, because 2 years of savings went into uh, paying off the fees for. That's a worst case assumption, very pessimistic, but still works. Okay, most of the students pay off their loans by the end of 4 years after they set their foot in the United States. Okay, this is for masters. Now in India, for 2 years you don't do, and then you don't earn any money. It's not, masters is not as expensive. You don't earn any money, but you start earning after 2 years. Now this is where the difference comes. At the end of 2 years, when you're appearing for job interviews in US, the number of opportunities available is still much higher. In India, there are some very good teams which do very high quality work, analog and RF work, but that number, the quantity is smaller. Okay, so you have fewer options here, fewer very high quality options in India. In US, that option, the pool is really large. You have a huge choice to pick from. Okay, or a lot of options to pick from. That is one clear cut advantage. Okay, now I'll compare this with BTech degree. At the end of 4 years, if you see financially, India, let's say you're doing a BTech in India and you finished your BTech in 4 years. By the end of this 4 years, you would have earned financially, if you see, you are better than these two options, money wise. Okay, you would have earned a decent amount of money by the end of these 4 years. Now the difference comes here in United States after the 4 years. Now if you see the salaries that you get in United States, when you compare it with a salary of an engineer who works MTech after 2 years, I'm comparing the salaries. That's the right thing to do, because I shouldn't compare right away. Right away, if you compare a salary of an MTech student who graduates from an India versus an MS student, the salary is a huge difference, almost 3 to 4x. 4x. But if you see after 4 years, now if I'm comparing it, I'll still say the difference is at least 3x. The salary difference is easily 3x. Okay, so that's the difference you would normally see. The salary difference at the end of 4 years. It depends on the company. Let's say you work really hard, you do brilliantly, you do really well. There are some companies which give you good hikes, but still 3x is still a pessimistic. So I'm going to go with that number. It's still a pessimistic number. So 3x will be your difference in salaries. This is, again, these are all very rough estimates. Don't quote me some number and say, okay, look, it is 3.8x. I'm just giving a rough estimate. Salaries are definitely higher at the end of 4 years. Okay, that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, here, after BTech, if you work for 4 years directly in a company, you will normally be involved in one complete product cycle. So in analog and digital design, usually you must be knowing you have different phases, right? So you start with the architecture, circuit design, then you go to the layouts, after layouts, it's finally GDS handoff, then the silicon comes back, the packaging, and you test a chip, and you see if the product works or not. Okay, so you go through one full product cycle, then the product sells, the product is really good, it's competitive, then the product sells and the company makes lots of money. Now you go through this full cycle. A lot of engineers who, when I was graduating, I'll talk about my experience in TI, who are in very high positions. I have found them to just have a BTech degree, because most of them were hired in 1990s and early 2000s. For some of us who couldn't afford to go to United States, because going to United States had a lot of paperwork and then there was a lot of money involved, loans had to be taken, but still a lot of them braved it because of the financial benefits you get in the long run. Okay, so they still went, but some of us, they didn't want to go, so they stayed back in the country. And those students, those of them who went on to have great careers, what they did, what I noticed in some exceptional cases, at the end of 4 or 5 years, they understood the complete product cycle, and within at the end of 5, 6 years, I saw them starting companies. Okay, because they went through this complete product cycle, they knew what was the market needs, and by then they had also developed enough skill sets, and they knew that they can also start a company. And then, while working with the company, some engineers get a chance to interact with the customers, so they use some networks and then they started companies. Not very, I mean, see, starting a company in analog design requires a lot more expertise, but these young engineers would, collaborate or make good friendships with partnerships with senior engineers, and they have come out to found some companies. Okay, that is something. This is a success story. Doesn't apply to everyone, but I'm just giving a story. I mean, telling you a possibility that has happened. Okay. Now, this after masters, you work for 4 years. Now, if you see, if you compare the salary within 2 years, these guys can out earn what you get in India after these options. If you just compare a simple option where they just go with a normal career trajectory, I'll talk about the careers in analog design. When you go with a normal career trajectory, then if you compare your job within a few years, the engineers in US will easily out earn the engineers who are getting paid in India. Okay, so that's where the pay difference comes, especially in the initial stages of your career. Now, what happens is that to understand the pay difference after some time, I mean, when you go for higher and higher positions in your career, you will see that the pay differences start narrowing down. When you move to very high positions, principal and staff and senior staff, principal and higher positions, the pay difference becomes smaller. It's no longer 3x or 4x. It becomes even smaller. Now, let me just tell you something important. When we were graduating, if you compare the pay scale differences between India and United States, it was much higher. It was easily 8 times, 10 times. That was the pay difference. That difference had significantly narrowed down now. Okay, that's mainly because a lot of centers, we have more R&D centers opening up in India, and those R&D centers have become competitive. So most of them, one company starts paying higher, so every company is forced to give higher pay. So things have started becoming much better in India now than what it was 10, 15 years ago. The pay difference was even higher. So it made a lot of sense to go for an MS degree back then. But now that gap is definitely narrowing down, and the gap narrows down even higher as you move to higher and higher positions in India itself. I mean, in India itself, in analog or digital design. Now, as I said, there are very rare cases where people have gone for startup after BTech degree itself. I've seen some of my people who have joined along with me in TI go through this option, but that's a very small number. So I'm not going to use that as a statistic. So we will look at just engineers having a career. Now, this is where, after a few years, when you move to higher and higher positions within India itself, to roles like, I'll talk about what are those roles, then something interesting happens. So, to understand that, first I'll go back and talk about the positions, and then, then you'll understand why this interesting thing happens. Okay, so I'll start with the career options. So generally, undergraduates start with a design engineer position. After 1 or 2 years, depending on the industry, how well you do, you're promoted to senior design. Then you go to lead engineer. So this is just a rough idea about the promotion cycles in industry. It may vary from industry to industry. The names for the positions will vary from industry to industry, sorry, company to company. Okay, but roughly this is just to give you an idea how things are, and you can roughly see what applies to you. Okay, this is something I've generally observed across many companies. So I'm just going to use this positions to describe what are the career trajectories in all these companies. Start with design engineer after undergrad, become a senior engineer. If you have a master's degree, you directly start here. Okay, and then you become, after 1 or 2 years, depending on how you perform, you become a lead engineer. Then after a few years, you start, go through the whole product cycle. You do very well the work that you do. See, how do you judge whether you're doing very well in an industry? Is that the work that you do should work in silicon and become a product, and the company should start earning money out of it. Okay, so that's the general way your success is assessed. So then from lead engineer, you become a lead engineer. After a few years, then you become a staff design engineer. Now when you become a staff engineer, this is after, let's say, 6 7 years into your career. See, for some it may even be faster, but this is a usual trajectory. Maybe 6 7 8 years you are a staff engineer. Now, at this point, some engineers are given a choice. You can start becoming what you call as individual contributor. That is, which is something I like. I'm more in this category of individual contributors, meaning I'm somebody who likes to be on the technical side of the job. I like to do the architecture, the circuit design throughout my career. So then you have a different career trajectory for the individual contributors, or you can become a manager where you lead a group of engineers doing the projects, and you will take up responsibility for a product. Okay, so then at that point you can take a career decision. Do you want to stay in, keep doing circuit design, or you are okay with managing people? So then you have these options called design manager. You can branch out as a design manager, senior design manager, and eventually after a few, this will take much longer, depends. So 20 30 years, 20 25 years into this in this field, and eventually you can become a director, senior director, and sometimes if the top level management positions free up, you can even move to even higher positions within the company itself. Okay, if some top level management guy decides to leave, then you can even move to even higher and higher positions within the company itself. Okay, CTO or other positions, very top level management positions. Now, on the I see the individual contributor side, you go on to become senior staff, principal engineer. So this, when you become principal engineer, you are at a position where you can independently understand the product, translate it to specifications for circuit engineers, and you should also be able to guide undergrad. I mean, the fresh engineers in your team. You should be able to solve problems that others are facing in your team. So you will be when you reach a principal engineer position, you should have those abilities. Okay, you should be able to translate product specifications to block level or architecture level specifications. You should be able to come up with architectures. Okay, and so this is a very important position. And for me, I will compare this position is the technical skill level will be as good as any professor in a university. Okay, or at least an associate professor in a university. Then after few years of being a principal engineer, then you're graduated distinguished engineer and then fellows. Fellow is the ultimate position that are fellow. Then there are some companies have senior fellows and all that, but fellow is something that a technical person would dream of. This, that's the final stage you reach in any industry. Uh, so there are very few fellows in India. You can just count them in your fingers. That's the number. It's such a small number. It's very tough to become a fellow. You should be technically really good to rise to a position of a fellow. It's difficult to be a fellow than being a professor at one of the IITs. Okay, it's much easier to be a professor to become a professor at IITs than be a fellow in a very good semiconductor company. Okay, so this will take much longer time, but some exceptionally brilliant engineers attain it within 20-25 years. But this is the final stage for technical engineers. So these are all individual contributor positions. Okay, so now here, just having said this, now I'll see again, this is something I've generally given an idea in the semiconductor industry. It may vary from company to company. And I've just told you what are the requirements. At a principal engineer position, you should be able to, roughly, you should be able to come up with architecture on your own. So this is a highly valued position. Principal and even senior staff is a highly valued positions. Okay. Now I'll talk about demand and supply in India. So design and senior design engineer, these are the positions that you get after your BTech degrees and master's degrees, MS, ME degrees. Okay. These are positions you get after your BE and master's degrees. So because we have, especially India has one of the highest number of universities across the world. Okay. If you compare it, we are almost second, probably only to United States in producing the number of undergraduates. Now there is a debate about the quality, but still, even good quality universities, we produce a decent amount of good quality engineers. So since there is a huge demand, the supply, since there is a huge supply, there is also demand, but supply is at least able to meet it. Okay, now there are complaints from the industry citing that they are seeing some decline in the quality. We'll talk about that in a different video, but that's a different reason. I'll address it separately. But right now, we'll go with the idea that the supply is not so bad. Okay, we still have a supply. So that is why if you compare the salaries to India versus US, it's not, the difference is huge because you might ask, if the same R&D centers are in India and United States, why shouldn't the pays be at least comparable? Okay, the reason is because the demand is also there, supply, and also supply is there, so the pay scales are not being matched, and mainly they start R&D centers in India for financial reasons. You could get the same quality of work with slightly with of course lower money. That is the reason why they started in India. And but now things are getting difficult because once more and more R&D centers come up in India, once the demand increases, then the salaries also start going up. But the important thing to notice here is that the supply is also pretty good here. We have a huge BTech, MTech population who are getting filled. A lot of universities go to these IITs, NITs bids for hiring, and they're able to fill those positions. Now, what happens here is that once an engineer moves above the technical ladder, once you move in this ladder to senior staff, and these positions, the interesting thing that's happening, which I've noticed, is that especially it was very common in last decade. Most of the engineers, it doesn't matter where you got your degrees from. Once you reach these positions, senior staff and principal, or even staff higher after staff positions, you would you would get offers from Europe and other places, even United States also. Okay, because there is a huge demand for these positions. Technically highly skilled engineers, there is a huge demand for them, but the supply doesn't really meet the demand. Okay, so that is why you will see that these engineers get poached. So we have a lot of engineers in this region in India, but there is a demand for principal and senior staff engineers. Now, these engineers are very important for a semiconductor company because these are the guys who decide the top level architecture specifications, and therefore the skill set necessary is very high. Okay. In India, we don't have this idea of high quality PhDs joining industry. We do have some very high quality PhDs coming out, but that number is much smaller compared to United States. United States has the huge advantage of having a very good PhD ecosystem. In fact, that's one of the best in the world. And those PhD students join companies after a few years. They 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 have mastered or thought about a single problem for a very long time. So naturally, they'll have an advantage and edge. So they form these positions. In India, on the other hand, these engineers learn through experience. In industry itself, they go through the training that a PhD student goes through. Okay, so once they come to the senior staff and principal positions, because it's highly in demand across the world, these engineers, especially staff and above, get poached, or I shouldn't use the word, but they get a huge offers from US and Europe. Especially in the last decade, a lot of engineers would move away. After they reach these positions, they would move to the West. Some engineers do stay back because by the time you will be in your 30s when you reach these positions. So by the time in your 30s, you are more or less settled. So a lot of them don't want to change. They are in their comfort zone. So they don't want to make a transition to a different place. So they don't move. Okay. But some of them do go for it because you may have slight advantage moving to a first world. So they, better governance and better social security and all those reasons. So they go there. Okay. So that is why in India right now a lot of R&D centers have been established, but there is a dearth for talent in this region. Okay. Now because of which the demand is high, but the supply is very low. Now because the supply is very low, the only way to get or attract talent is to pay very high. So therefore the salaries here go up significantly, even in India itself. If you go to principal and senior staff positions, good semiconductor companies pay you pretty well. So that salary gap becomes smaller when you compare it to the United States. But here the gap is very high because there is supply, demand is high, but supply is also there. But when it comes to this part, the demand is high, but the supply is not there. And what do we need to create supply? To create supply, we need high quality PhDs, okay, who are working for a few years in industry. Plus, or you need very high quality engineers who have done some brilliant work, in the industry itself. Out of them, a good chunk of them are getting poached by the Western nations. I mean, they go to Europe, sometimes even to Taiwan. So they get, most of these engineers get very good offers, so they leave. So that leaves Indian semiconductor ecosystem with fewer engineers in this range, in this positions, senior staff and principal. So because they are fewer, the demands are higher. The demand is higher, the salaries also are very competitive. Okay, so that's why the salaries get higher here, and there is a huge, very steep rise in salaries from as you move to higher and higher positions in India itself. The rise is there in United States as well, but it's not as steep. The reason for that is what I've just described. And also, you should keep in mind that a lot of things are changing now. More and more companies are coming in India, and that's why I'm saying this, because a lot of companies have open positions which are not get filled up. They're open for a few months, 6 months, 7 months. I'm seeing that, and those positions are not getting filled because they're not finding the right candidates. Okay, so there is a dearth for these positions. So that's why the salaries are pretty high in this range. So now we'll come back to this, keeping this in mind. So I've described all these options. Now the question is, you need to ask yourself what you want with your own life. Some of you may want to stay with your parents. Okay, and then I've seen, and they have aging parents when they're in their 30s or 40s, so they want to stay close to home. So I have seen engineers returning back from MS, from US to India, in principal positions, when they are in these positions, principal or higher positions, or even senior staff positions. Those engineers, they get paid pretty decently because they know that when they return in these positions, they get paid pretty decently in India itself. So the pay gap is not so much. They don't lose heavily on finances. At the same time, they also get to be closer to their families. So they return back after a few years. After 10 years in US, they return back. Now, if you should ask me, you will say, okay, I'm going to spend 4 years where I don't get any money. If you compare it versus these other options, it looks financially not a great choice. It doesn't look like a very great choice financially, going to US if I just presented it. But you should keep in mind, a lot of them, I know people who used to go during my times, of course, the pay gap was significantly different. A lot of them wanted to settle in United States. So they probably would be spending 40 active years in US. So in 40 years, 4 years is a very small time, so they're okay to spend those 4 years. Or I have seen a trend of, some very good engineers or, or academicians returning back to India after some 10 years or 12, or 15 years, you know. So they have returned back in these positions when they knew that they can actually get a pretty decent pay. After a point, once you earn out a decent money really doesn't matter. I mean, I believe that most technically very good technical talents don't really care about lavishly spending money. Once they have a decent backing, financial security, you have medical insurance, you have financial backup, then you don't really need so much money. So then they return back and they just pursue whatever they want to do. Now, one final thing which I'd like to say, which is very important for all of you engineers, especially if you're immigrating to a different place, um, keep in mind that it it's a very good thing. You should always go to place where you find your best opportunities, where your talents are treated well. But it's also important to give back to your motherland. It's very important because I'll just give this example, which I felt when I was watching this documentary on how space agency in India was founded. So we had two brilliant minds, named Vikram Sarabhai and Homi Baba, who came from very affluent and rich families, so they could afford to go to UK and get educated. But we also had another scientist named Abdul Kalam, who comes from a very poor background. He dreamt of, building rockets but comes from a very poor background. Now, the good thing is that these engineers, I mean, these brilliant minds, when I say they're physicists, experimental physicists like Vikram Sarabhai and Homi Baba, they started research centers in India. And those research centers gave opportunities to people who could not have had access to this high quality education. So that is why it's very important, when you give back, it really gives opportunities to those who really cannot afford to even go for an MS in US. Okay, so even my professors, Professor Nagendra and Shanti, when they return back, the big contribution I would say personally from their side, some of us, some of our friends in the lab, uh, of course, the country benefited a lot from their teaching and everything. But from my side, or some of my very close friends who I know, we benefited mainly because of the environment that they created. There was a lab, and we could just sit in the lab and discuss among ourselves and ideate and produce and work and create a lot of technical knowledge. All that happened because of the space that they created, and that's why it's very important, and that's why we have a lot of R&D centers opening up today in the country, because they think that they know that they'll find good talent in the country, because of these opportunities that people like them had created in the country. So that's why it's very important. Okay, so that's it. I've given an opinion. Probably I'll make another video. I'll just see if I've missed something. I'll make another video, and you can pose your questions in the comment section. And if I go through and then if I find something interesting, I'll make a follow-up video for all of this. So I've given you all the options. Okay, uh, financially, whatever suits you better, and what personally you feel. If you want to be closer to your parents, or you're okay with going to United States, you want to settle in US. I can't judge any of your choices. It's your own individual choice. You do what you think is best for you. I've listed out all the possible options. Financially, in the long run, you don't see a big difference in current times. Okay, you can have in principal and higher positions, you can have pretty decent salaries in India itself today. Okay, but the teams, the number of companies are still smaller. It's growing, which is a very good sign, but that number is still smaller. Okay, but it is definitely going much better than what it used to be a decade ago. Okay, there were few principal engineers, especially, are important because any successful semiconductor company in India today, which is doing very high quality work, I've generally noticed all those companies tend to have a very high concentration of high quality engineers and senior staff and principal positions. Okay, it's very important. Okay, so just keep all these things in mind and then make an informed decision. Thank you.